They say some houses remember the people who lived inside them. Some houses keep their memories hidden behind walls, whispering in the silence, waiting for someone to listen. In the quiet outskirts of a small American town, there stood a house that no one visited willingly. Its windows were clouded, its shutters hung crooked, and yet inside, a family had made it their home. On the surface, they seemed like any other family, a mother, a father, 2 children. But what happened behind those locked doors was far from ordinary. There were nights when the walls seemed to breathe, when shadows moved with intent, and when a child's laughter turned into a sound too hollow to be innocent. What you are about to hear is not a story whispered in passing, but an account that survived through fragments, diaries hidden beneath floorboards, letters never sent, photographs that captured eyes staring at something unseen. Historians, psychologists, and even law enforcement struggled to make sense of it. They left the house more haunted than when they arrived. This family, trapped by circumstance and by something far older than they could understand, endured a terror that seemed to seep from the very foundation. They were ordinary people, yet the ordinary was only a thin veneer. Beneath it, darkness had grown like mold, spreading quietly until it could not be ignored. And what followed, day by day, year by year, is the kind of horror that no one speaks of, because to speak of it is to risk awakening it again. By the end of this story, you may begin to understand why some secrets are buried so deeply, why some houses are left to rot, and why some families disappear from history as if they were never real. But for now, we step through the threshold into a house of pure terror, and we begin to uncover what it kept hidden. The first hints of trouble were subtle, almost imperceptible. A misplaced object here, a fleeting shadow there, things that could easily be explained away. But over time, the unease grew, insidious and relentless. The mother, a woman with a quiet strength, began noticing patterns no one else could see. Doors that were locked the night before stood open in the morning. Footsteps echoed in hallways when the house was empty. The children spoke of a presence they called the Watcher, describing a figure that lingered just beyond sight, never fully seen, but always there. The father dismissed it at first, attributing the fear to stress, to imagination. But the unease seeped into his sleep, twisting his dreams into nightmares he could not escape. Neighbors noticed too, the faint cries that drifted through the windows, the eerie stillness when the family's windows were dark for days at a time. Attempts to leave the house ended strangely. Cars wouldn't start, roads seemed to loop back, and the compulsion to return grew impossible to resist. It was as if the house itself had become a living thing, a predator patient and cunning, feeding on the family's routines, bending reality around them. And beneath the creeping fear, a deeper, more unsettling truth emerged. This was not random. The house remembered them. It remembered the lives that had passed through it before, the families who had vanished, the secrets it had swallowed. Every sound, every shadow, every whispered fear was part of a long history no outsider could ever fully understand. And slowly, painfully, the family began to realize that leaving was no longer a choice. They were tethered to the house, bound by something older than them, something patient, something hungry. It wasn't just a building, it was a trap, a repository of anguish and terror, and they were its newest captives. As the days bled into weeks, the family's life began to fracture in ways that were both subtle and horrifying. Sleep became a battlefield. The children would wake screaming, eyes wide with terror, pointing at corners that remained empty when their parents rushed in. The mother started hearing whispers in the walls, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to echo her deepest fears back to her. The father, once skeptical, found himself standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at a knife he could not remember picking up, as if drawn by a force he could not resist. Objects moved of their own accord, books, chairs, even family photographs, sometimes smashed into shards on the floor. The house seemed to study them, testing their limits, learning their weaknesses. Meals became silent rituals, with each member of the family retreating into their own corner of fear, speaking only when necessary. And yet, the terror was never overt, never a sudden attack. It was psychological, patient, like water eroding stone. The walls watched, the floorboards listened, and something else, something older, waited in the darkness of the basement. Rumors among locals spoke of the basement long before this family arrived. They said it had been sealed for decades, yet when the children dared to peek, they saw nothing but a yawning blackness that seemed to pulse, alive and breathing. The mother felt it, a pull she could neither fight nor ignore, a compulsion that tightened around her chest. They were no longer just living in a house. They were participants in a slow unraveling, each day eroding the boundaries of reality. And while they tried to cling to normalcy, to pretend the horror was a trick of the mind, the house made it clear it had claimed them, and it would not let go until it had extracted every ounce of fear it could. The family had become actors in a story written long before their arrival, one that none of them would ever escape. It was in the third month that the family's world became unrecognizable. The air inside the house carried a weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to press against their chests, even when the windows were open. The children no longer spoke of the watcher. They had stopped speaking entirely at times, their faces frozen in expressions of dread that no parent could interpret. The mother began seeing glimpses of figures reflected in mirrors, faces that were not her own, twisted and mournful, staring back at her with eyes that knew every sin, every regret. At night, the house's sounds grew deliberate. The creaking of the stairs became a slow march, each step a countdown, a reminder that someone or something was always moving, always watching. Doors would slam without wind, and the walls would vibrate with a low hum, like a warning. Even the family's pets, once lively, cowered in corners, refusing to enter certain rooms. The father, now a shell of the man who had first laughed off their fears, found himself drawn to the basement. Something called to him, a whisper beneath the floorboards, and he felt compelled to obey. Down there in the darkness, he discovered remnants of the families who had lived before, notes scrawled in frantic handwriting, photographs with faces scratched out, toys left abandoned. And in each item, he felt the same unrelenting gaze of the house, as if it were cataloging him, testing him, claiming him as part of its collection. The realization sank in slowly, like ice in the bloodstream. This house was not just haunted, it was conscious, it was alive. It fed on fear, nurtured it, and demanded tribute. And now, this family, once ordinary, once hopeful, was fully enmeshed in its ecosystem of horror, trapped in a cycle older than memory, a darkness that had no intention of letting them go. The house had moved from being a place they lived in to being a force that lived through them, bending their minds, breaking their spirits, and rewriting the very notion of what it meant to feel safe. By the 6th month, the family was unrecognizable, even to themselves. The mother, once vibrant and attentive, spoke in fragments, her sentences trailing into silence as though the house had stolen her words. The father's eyes were hollow, scanning corners for movements no one else could see. The children had stopped laughing entirely, their small hands trembling, their bodies stiff with fear. Every night the house revealed new horrors, rooms that shifted while no one looked, ceilings that seemed impossibly low, walls that whispered secrets too vile to repeat aloud. In the basement, they found symbols etched into the stone floor, circular patterns that seemed to pulse when stared at too long. The mother tried to erase them, to scrub away the marks, but they returned the next morning, untouched and waiting. Friends and neighbors, sensing the family's withdrawal, knocked on the door, only to be met with silence. The house itself seemed to mock the world outside, sealing its occupants further into its grip. And then came the moments that could not be denied, the things no rational mind could explain. Shadows that moved against the grain of the sun, objects levitating, whispers that spoke of past tragedies with exacting detail. The family realized, with a growing horror, that this house did not just haunt them, it remembered them. It cataloged their fears, fed on their despair, and shaped reality around them to tighten its hold. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? They had become both prisoners and performers, each day a test of endurance, each night a deeper dive into madness. And the truth settled over them like a fog. Some houses are not meant for living. They are meant for claiming, for remembering, for never letting go. The 7th month brought a change that was almost imperceptible at first. The house no longer needed to frighten them. It had already broken them. The family moved through it like shadows, silent and tentative, never daring to linger in any room too long. The whispers became constant, threading through their thoughts, shaping their dreams, eroding the barrier between what was real and what belonged to the house. At times they would find themselves speaking words they did not intend, confessing fears and regrets that the house seemed to demand. And in the basement, the pulsing symbols grew brighter, almost alive, as if the house itself had become a living eye, watching, recording, anticipating every movement. The father once tried to destroy the patterns with a hammer, striking at the stone floor again and again, only to find his strength failing, his arms heavy as if the house itself resisted. The mother cried silently in the kitchen, rocking the children who no longer asked for bedtime stories, because the house had rewritten what comfort meant. Days and nights blurred, time became meaningless. Visitors who attempted to check on them spoke later of strange occurrences, the family's door opening without anyone touching it, the sound of soft footsteps on the 2nd floor, a low, chanting hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. And yet the family could not leave. Roads looped back inexplicably. Cars failed in strange ways. Every exit was a trap. Every attempt at escape met with subtle, insidious resistance. The house was patient. The house was eternal. And most terrifying of all, the The family realized they were no longer the victims, they were now part of its memory, part of its collection, echoes in a gallery of despair curated over decades. The house had succeeded. It had claimed not just their presence, but their very sense of self, bending their minds to its will, until they were shadows of the people they had once been. In the end, the house kept its secrets well. Long after the neighbors stopped noticing the lights, long after the town whispered about the family that had vanished, the house remained silent and waiting, as if nothing had ever happened. Investigators arrived months later, called by distant relatives who hadn't heard from the family in years. They found the doors locked, the windows barred, and inside only remnants of lives erased, furniture coated in dust, toys scattered as if left mid-play, photographs torn and defaced. There was no sign of struggle, no clear explanation, only the lingering impression that something had been waiting for them, shaping their fate from the shadows. The basement was empty, yet the symbols remained, glowing faintly when the air was still, as if the house itself exhaled its history into the silence. And the truth that law enforcement could not articulate, that psychologists refused to theorize, became clear to anyone who dared to enter those walls. Some places are alive in ways we cannot comprehend. They remember, they wait, and they take. This house had taken a family, absorbed their fear, their pain, their very essence, and preserved it in the quiet of its halls. What remains is not a home, but a warning. The house of pure terror is patient, it is enduring, and it is always hungry for the next family, the next story, the next fragment of life it can consume. The windows stare outward, blank and opaque, yet anyone who looks inside might feel, for a fleeting moment, that the house is aware of them. And perhaps, somewhere deep in its walls, the echoes of that family still whisper, telling us what happens when fear becomes a resident, and when a home is no longer a sanctuary but a predator. The house waits, as it always has, for the next soul willing or unlucky enough to enter.